So good afternoon, and assalam. We are assembled here on the anniversary of a day that changed the world. Since September 11th, 2001, we've witnessed two new wars, a dramatic increase of state power in the name of security, and a radical politics of identity. In Western countries, Muslims are increasingly being perceived as hostile agents. Witness the frenzy over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in Manhattan and the thankfully suspended plans to burn Korans in Florida today. We've all heard the warning that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Yet, the history we choose to remember can make all the difference. And in Afghanistan, there's plenty of history. The war there continues now in its 9th year. To many of us, it's a country associated with endless violence, turbaned fanatics, and failure. To quote British Secretary of Defense Liam Fox, it seems a broken 13th century country. In light of these dim views and the mounting casualty list, many of us are asking how we got into this and where it's going. Today, I hope to give you a glimpse of the larger picture, the complicated past and present of Afghanistan, and its possible future. It's a future that will be significantly influenced by what we in Canada decide to do there. So I'm going to begin with a brief history and then address questions of why we're there, what effect it's had, and where it's going. We begin with this slide here. And I'm sure it's a face which is very familiar to most of you. It's one of the most well-known faces in Afghanistan. Her name is Sharbat Gul, and she was photographed in 1985 by Steve McCurry, a photographer working for National Geographic, in a refugee camp in Pakistan, which at the time was hosting many Afghan displaced persons. She was in a school tent, actually, at the time of the photograph. And in 2002, McCurry tracked her down again, and he rediscovered her in a remote village in the mountains of Tora Bora. In 2002, she then had 3 daughters. And she'd always wanted education. She never received it. She wanted it for her 3 daughters, but in 2002, there wasn't any available in her area. So Sharbat's story is one of many of the sort that we're quite familiar with. But let me now share with you some Afghan stories that are not so familiar. This is a picture taken in Kabul in the mid-1950s to early 1960s. And it's a phonograph or a record shop, and these are Afghans purchasing music. This is a group of nurses undergoing medical training at Kabul University in the same period. And these are members of the Parliamentary Assembly in Afghanistan, Kabul, again, late 50s, early 60s. At the time, many of them held PhDs. They were fairly cosmopolitan and look altogether different from the faces you would see today if you attended the Parliamentary Assembly in Kabul. So Afghanistan hasn't always looked the way we see it does today in the news. This is a map, and I've chosen one deliberately that shows you the neighboring countries, because they've had quite a significant influence on the politics of Afghanistan over the centuries. You can see that to the north, it's bordered by Tajikistan. And unsurprisingly, many of the people located in northern Afghanistan are of Tajik ethnicity. So there's a shared heritage there. Similarly with Uzbekistan, which borders Balkh province. You can see that there's Iran bordering the west. And the longest single border shared is with Pakistan, which has probably had more influence than any of the other countries over Afghanistan's history, particularly in recent history. Now, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is notoriously porous, as you may be aware. It's pretty much a border which exists in maps and official documents only, not so much in practice. There's a lot of movement across that border. And indeed, the population of Afghanistan, which runs along that border, is Pashtun, as are the inhabitants of Pakistan just over the line in the mountainous areas there. So they share more than geographic proximity. There's a shared language, there's a shared ethnicity, there are many shared customs. Sometimes they even share closer family ties. More of that in a moment. Afghanistan is composed of 34 provinces, and it has a population of approximately 23 million. But there are over 50 ethnic groups. The Pashtuns, whom I just mentioned, are one of them, but there are also Tajiks in the north, Hazaras, Uzbeks, Herati, Pashani, Kuchi, to name just a few. There are many others. While it's overwhelmingly a Muslim country, there are sectarian divisions in Afghanistan as well. Now, the Pashtun, who are located mainly in the south and somewhat southeast, are Sunni Muslims. The populations in the north, particularly Tajiks and Hazara, etc., are Shi'i. So, as in Iraq, you have a very strong sectarian cleavage. It involves differences in practice, and it underlines perhaps some of the other ethnic differences between them because it's an added source of controversy. The languages spoken predominantly are Pashto, spoken by the Pashtun, and Dari, which is a dialect of Farsi, the language spoken in Iran. Now I'm going to take you back to the 19th century to look at our political history here. This is a cartoon produced in Britain at the time, early 19th century, and here the Emir, Dost Muhammad of Afghanistan, is depicted between the Russian bear and the English lion, with the caption underneath, "Save me from my friends." Now, this is in fact a representation of what was going on at the time. You see, The Great Game was the title of British foreign policy aimed at keeping Russian influence out of Afghanistan. And the reason why the British were so concerned about this was because, of course, they wanted to protect their rule in India. And they saw Afghanistan, historically a link amongst many countries over the Silk Road, as a potential threat, that if someone got into Afghanistan, they would then be able to have easy access to India. So Britain was very concerned with keeping Russia out. They proposed an alliance with this Emir, Mohammad Dost, of Afghanistan, to fortify the border against Russian incursion. Russia attempted to annex parts of Afghanistan in 1838. So the British then wanted to invade and install a pro-British puppet by the name of Shah Shuja Durrani. Persia then allied itself with Russia. The British were successful in installing Shah Shuja, but predictably they could only maintain him at great cost, both monetary and military. So after a series of costly battles and a lot of Afghan resistance, the British finally withdrew in 1842. 3 decades later, the Russians sent an uninvited diplomatic mission to Afghanistan, which immediately sent off alarm bells in London. So the British invaded again in 1878, causing the Second Afghan War. Now, Britain proved unable to occupy Afghanistan permanently. However, it was successful in controlling foreign affairs there until 1919, when Afghanistan became independent after the Third Anglo-Afghan War, which lasted only a month. Now, this is an image of some Afghan government officials in the early part of the 20th century, during the reign of King Amanullah Khan, under whom Afghanistan gained its independence. This king was quite progressive. He instituted a number of very significant reforms, all the more so when you consider the early time in which they were occurring. In 1924, he issued the Nizamname-e Arusi law, or national marriage law. It forbade forced marriage, it set a minimum age for marriage, and it provided avenues for women to access justice if they had abusive husbands. So this was quite an early time, especially given a lot of other countries in the region, for Afghanistan to bring in this sort of legislation. Now, King Amanullah Shah followed King Amanullah Khan's progressive tendencies in 1935 and made primary education free and compulsory for both sexes in Afghanistan. I'm talking primary education here. His queen Soraya was significant in opening a lot of girls' schools and arguing in a very sustained fashion that female equality was in fact required by Muslim tradition and that government policy was now going to follow suit. Just to give you a sense of the time period and how significant this was, I want to show you when some other countries instituted free and compulsory primary education. Now, the United States, predictably, did so quite early. And the reason I have two dates here was that it was Massachusetts which began the trend in 1852, and Mississippi, which was the last. So the entire country succeeded in implementing this legislation in 1918. Turkey, under Ataturk, did so in 1924. China, not until 1986, and India, 2010. Now, a lot of this has to do with capacity, but it's nevertheless significant that as early as 1935, this was on the books in Afghanistan. Now, during the 1950s, this trend continues. Prime Minister Daoud included women in international delegations. He also hired them in the flight industry. He made them quite visible. He also instituted a forcible unveiling campaign, which, as you might predict, was not well received. People don't tend to embrace a policy when it's forced upon them. So this created a lot of resistance, unfortunately, to his rule. However, in 1964, King Zahir Shah, in his constitution, guaranteed the equal status of women in Afghanistan. This picture is a picture of a biology class at Kabul University, which, as you can see, is co-ed. There are men and women studying side by side biology. And women, in fact, taught in universities. They pursued careers as doctors and scientists. In fact, there were more female members in the Kabul University's science and mathematics departments in 1964 than there were in many in the United States, which is notable. You all know what was going on, of course, in the United States in 1964. It was a tumultuous time, shall we say. But there was a very large number of women in Kabul teaching and working. Now, I don't intend to suggest that Kabul is all of Afghanistan. It has always been significantly ahead of the rest of the country, but that's not unusual. We see that in many other developing countries. There is an urban-rural distinction, that in cities, the promotion of mixing between men and women, of the breakdown of sort of social class distinctions, more economic opportunity, is common in many countries, not only Afghanistan. So the fact that Kabul should be much more relaxed about women's public space and so on is not so remarkable. Just a picture of Zora Daoud. In 1972, she became Miss Afghanistan because they had a national beauty pageant. Hard to imagine today, but it's true. And she went on to compete internationally in the Miss Universe competition. But now on to more serious matters. In 1978, a Soviet coup overthrew President Daoud Khan, and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was created under the People's Democratic Party, which was a communist party in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, again, there were incentives for literacy, but these took the form of forcible policies. So the party would send teams out into the provinces and rural areas, and they would knock on doors and round up women by force and herd them into the local school where they were compelled to attend literacy classes. You can imagine how well this went down with the local population. So there was a lot of resistance to the People's Democratic Party, even though their intentions in spreading literacy might have been good. The Soviets ruled in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, and throughout, there was significant Afghan resistance and insurgency. Now, you know what else was going on politically on the world stage in this period. The Cold War dominated politics in the United States. And so Soviet presence in Afghanistan was perceived in the United States as a direct threat, as an extension of the red line, as it were. So President Reagan sent billions of dollars to support the Mujahideen, which is the name given to those who were fighting against the Soviets. Mujahideen, if you break it down, means those who are waging jihad, and jihad was the name given by these insurgent groups to what they were doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what the word means, but they were fairly extreme in their ideology, and that was how they portrayed the struggle. So Reagan sent billions of dollars, but he didn't do it directly. He channeled this aid through Pakistan. So Reagan would write the checks. They would go to the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, and Pakistan would then decide how to dole out that money, which groups. The result of that, of course, was to allow Pakistan to build up a number of protégés and groups which they thought were friendly to their own strategic interests. So people like Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a Tajik, also known as the Lion of Panjshir, was very effective at killing Soviets, didn't receive a lot of funds, despite what Charlie Wilson's War might have you believe, if you saw that film. However, others like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was Pashtun, and very much in line with a certain Islamist ideology being promoted in Pakistan at that time, received a great amount of those funds. So there were training camps in Pakistan along that border shared, where with the force of American cash, a lot of insurgents were equipped, were provided special training, and were then sent back into Afghanistan to shoot down Soviet helicopters. So the result of this, of course, is that the Soviets leave by 1989. And finally, in 1992, the remaining government, which was sympathetic to the Soviets, is toppled, President Najibullah. The United States at this point, seeing that the Soviets were gone and the Berlin Wall, by 1992 had fallen, decided they had no further strategic interest in the region and promptly withdrew the support. They didn't leave anybody on the ground. They pretty much turned their backs on Afghanistan. And what ensued was chaos. Because now, the very same insurgent groups who had a common enemy in the Soviets turned to struggle for power amongst themselves. At the time that President Najibullah's government collapsed in 1992, women still comprised 50% of the human resources in the higher education system. But that was shortly to finish. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was the leader of a Pashtun insurgent group, Hizb-i-Islami, races for Kabul to try and beat Ahmad Shah Massoud, who's the leader of a very powerful Tajik resistance movement, later known as the Northern Alliance. Now, Massoud arrives in Kabul first, so his forces occupy, and there's an agreement amongst the different Mujahideen groups to establish a rotating presidency, so that there'll be a power-sharing agreement. Unfortunately, Hekmatyar is not going to have any of that. The Pashtun, in fact, have traditionally been the rulers of Afghanistan. So for the first time, there was a Tajik occupying Kabul, and this didn't go over well with Hekmatyar. So he demanded the presidency, and he was openly supported in this bid by Pakistan. Now, to explain why, Pakistan has always had a vested interest in securing a friendly government in Afghanistan, one which keeps the distance from India. We've already spoken about the large Pashtun population which is shared in the northern parts of Pakistan and in parts of Afghanistan. And non-Pashtuns in Afghanistan have frequently courted support from countries that are not friendly to Pakistan, such as India, Iran, and Russia. So Pakistan wants Pashtun in Kabul because they will not be likely to pursue a foreign policy which will bring in any of these less friendly countries from Pakistan's point of view. In addition to that, there's, of course, the Kashmir issue between Pakistan and India. And the training of insurgents, which occurred with U.S. funding at the time the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, was also the same funds and the same camps were used to train insurgents for the Kashmir insurgency. So Pakistan wanted to retain those bases on the border and in Afghanistan, and needed, again, a friendly government, one which shared a lot of the same ideology, particularly this heavy Islamist emphasis, so that they could continue to use the area as a base for that insurgency platform. So the struggle between Hekmatyar and Massoud continues. Hekmatyar shells Kabul and destroys it entirely. Many, many civilians are killed. And the country enters a period of civil war generally. It's not just around Kabul. So in 1994, you have a situation where it's very much separated into a bunch of fiefdoms controlled by local warlords who rule them as they will. There's highway robbery, there's mass theft, extortionate tax by your local strongman, highway robbery, lots of rape. So it's basically there's chaos, there's no centralized government, there's no law and order to speak of, and it's a horrific situation. Enter the Taliban. So, who are the Taliban? We hear lots about them. We now know the situation on the ground at the time that they emerged. The Taliban were young men who had been part of that Mujahideen training movement, which often took place in Pakistani madrasas with US funding. So they already had battle experience fighting against the Soviets, and they were all Pashtun, these young men who then coalesce and become the Taliban. What happened was, because of the situation in Afghanistan, where there was no security, a lot of them began to get together and said, we have to do something about this. So their objectives were to reinstate some sort of law and to get rid of the warlords and to implement their unique version of Sharia, one which is shared, I think, by nobody else in the world. But they had a particular vision of a state run by religious officials. And so they were led by a man named Mullah Omar, who they selected from their own ranks. And these were their goals. They emerged initially in Kandahar, in the Pashtun heartland. And by 1996, they had taken Kabul and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. In this same year, Osama bin Laden arrives as a guest of Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader. Now, bin Laden's group, Al-Qaeda, was very much nascent at that point. Not as much was known about it clearly as we know today. But he was very warmly welcomed by Mullah Omar, and in fact was given access to those same training bases in the mountains, Tora Bora and the others, shared in the border with Pakistan, which he used then to conduct a training for Islamist militants, many of whom came from around the world, as far afield as Yemen. There were people from the Philippines, from Indonesia, there were Arabs, there were Chechens, there were even some Uyghurs. So he used these bases for his own purposes and trained thousands at the time with Taliban support and Pakistan sponsorship as well. We all know, of course, what happened on September 11th. But I'd like to go back and just ask you to look at this slide, because we hear a lot about the Taliban now and how they are the inveterate enemies of the United States and Western countries. But here you have a picture of Ronald Reagan meeting with Mujahideen, the ones he was funding. And at the time, in the haze of the Cold War, the bet was made that anybody who is a reliable fighter against the communists is a friend of America and of other Western non-communist countries. So it doesn't matter what other objectives they may have or how opposite they may be from the values that we cherish at home. As long as abroad these people are willing to kill communists, we're willing to support them. And not just with the force of arms and cash. I mean, this was a moral equivalence of America's founding fathers. Well, we know what life under the Taliban was like. I don't want to rehash all the gory details. But as a quick reminder, not only, of course, were women unable to go out for any reason unless they were completely covered and accompanied by a male relative, but even the windows of houses had to be painted black so that nobody could look in and glimpse a woman. They were kept at home in places with no light. And they couldn't even have access to doctors who were men. So women who are delivering a child or who are in desperate need of medical assistance, covered in a burqa, accompanied by their male relative, come to one of the few remaining hospitals. There were very few after the Mujahideen had finished bombing everything in their civil war, and were turned away because they were told, no, you can't be treated by a male doctor, and there are some women at some rundown shelter somewhere on the other half of the city. You'll have to go and find them. And that was it. It was a horrific time. Music was illegal, and many other things. People were beaten in the streets by roving Taliban patrols, men and women for not having beards that were long enough, for having a painted fingernail. And people, of course, as you know, were stoned in stadiums in public for all sorts of offenses, real or imagined. So, that's not why Western forces actually intervened in Afghanistan. How did we get here? Well, I would like to remind you that this was not a preemptive American action which happened in isolation. The UN Resolution 1373 was passed before any troops entered Afghanistan, which authorized the use of violence against terrorism. And NATO led the construction of ISAF, which is an international security assistance force comprised of 41 countries, 28 of whom are NATO countries, the remainder non-NATO. So many countries go in. On October 7th, 2001, I have NATO strikes here, but at the time NATO was assembling it. It very quickly becomes, the name changes to ISAF because countries who are even outside of NATO want to get involved. By December 20th, 2001, President Karzai is heading an interim government in Kabul. And by 2003, there's enough organization that they can actually have a Loya Jirga, which is a grand assembly, and create a formal government, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So, why are we here? The strategic priorities for ISAF countries, and the United States in particular, were to remove al-Qaeda from Afghanistan and to eliminate Afghanistan as a terrorist base, because al-Qaeda was abetted by a very sympathetic Taliban government and indeed by friends they had over the line in Pakistan. The second objective was to establish a stable government and rule of law, because it was the lack of these things, the chaos of the Mujahideen period, which created the conditions permitting the Taliban to present themselves as an attractive option. Anything was better than complete lawlessness. And the question that many of us are asking now is, what good did it do? Well, Afghans initially welcomed ISAF forces in their relief at the end of Taliban rule. Reports from Kabul at that time are remarkable because the city came back to life. There was music suddenly, men were shaving their faces, there were high heels, and people walking in public without fear of roving beating patrols. But the country was in ruins. 80% of the educational infrastructure was destroyed. There were almost no government services and very widespread poverty. In the years since 2001, Afghanistan has made incredible strides forward, but there's a long way to go. I'd like to show you now just a few of the very measurable changes we can record. Education. Now here you have a graph which shows the recorded education rate, the enrollment figures for Afghanistan for as long as we have records recently. So in 1940, as you can see, the recorded enrollment is less than 500,000. There hasn't been a strong centralized government history in Afghanistan. We had those governments I showed you in the 50s and 60s, but the ability to actually get out with people on the ground and record numbers far afield has not been strong. So these are just what we have records for. You can see in 1975, you have an enrollment rate of over 1 million. In 1999, it's under 1 million, Mujahideen, Taliban period. And in 2002, you have this incredible spike. Now, what was going on was after international forces intervened, in 2002 and 2003, there was a back-to-school campaign, which was heavily funded by international countries, and Canada took a leading role in that. The objective was to get as many kids back into school as possible, even if it was just a school under a tree or under a tent. And the result was the largest enrollment rate in Afghanistan's history. At that time, you're looking at more than 4 million. It's increased since then. And females are a significant percentage of that number. Here you have another graph which details that more specifically. So in 2001, you see that the dark bars are male. In 2001, you have maybe 500,000 boys enrolled in school and no girls. By 2002, you have 1 million girls enrolled, and the number of boys has more than doubled. 2007, the numbers continue to grow. There is still a shortage of teachers and capacity. We need more. But the response to the provision of education has been overwhelming in Afghanistan. Now, apart from enrollment, which is there represented again, it's now nearly 6 million, females at 33% of that, which is the second graph here. Infant mortality has also improved significantly. The infant mortality rate was about 16% in 2001, and there has been a 23% reduction in that figure as of 2010. The access to healthcare, though, is perhaps the most astonishing figure here. In 2001, barely 9% of the population had access to any form of healthcare. In 2010, 85% have access to some form of healthcare. Very, very basic, in need of improvement, but some, as opposed to nothing. There are other changes. This is Habiba Sorabi, and she's the governor of Bamiyan province, which is actually in central Afghanistan, just slightly, it's almost bordering Kabul. She's the first female governor. To be a provincial governor is normally a post held by a local strongman who has his own posse or a lot of influence in Kabul. It's not a position traditionally held by women. So this is an example of what's been possible politically since 2001. This is a picture of women undergoing parliamentary training in Afghanistan. There are a great number of them. 25% of the seats in parliament, which is 249, are reserved for women. Of that number, 64 are being competed for in the parliamentary elections, which are occurring next Saturday in Afghanistan. The number of female candidates running for these seats has increased to 406 this year. It was 328 in 2005, and of course, there were none of them before 2002. But many in Kabul face threats to their lives and to their safety. These female candidates from Taliban commanders, from local insurgents, and from those who have vested interests and don't wish to see them there. An example of this, Najila Anjira is a businesswoman in Kabul, and she's received a death threat from a neighboring Taliban commander in Wardak province for daring to say negative things about the period of Taliban rule in Afghanistan. She's one example of a much larger problem. It was only the other week when 5 volunteers who were campaigning for a female candidate were shot to death in Herat province. The Taliban claimed credit for that. But here you see campaign pictures on the streets in Kabul. There are lots of men, but very visibly you have women campaigning. This is despite the threats. This is despite ongoing risk. These are women who have husbands and children and who leave the house every day not quite sure if they're going to return. And yet, after 9 years, we often hear, why are things still so bad? Why are the casualties mounting? So that we have to step back again to understand this a little bit. While international forces entered in force in 2001, it was in fact on September 12th, 2001, the day after the bombings in Manhattan, or the collision in Manhattan, that Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld were arguing for the simultaneous invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the day after. Now, there has never been even the claim that there's been a connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda or terrorism directed at the United States. And the claims of weapons of mass destruction, of course, which were very much in circulation at the time, have subsequently been discredited. There were long-standing ambitions in the U.S. administration for action in Iraq. And when Afghanistan was implicated in the 9/11 event, it immediately became a pretext to pursue a larger regional agenda. By November 2001, Bush had asked Rumsfeld to draw up Iraq war plans. And in 2002, the United States was already redeploying a lot of its manpower and economic resources to Iraq. So the result of this was leaving security in the hands of local warlords, the same guys who had been controlling their areas of turf during the Mujahideen period, at a very critical time, because you have a fragile interim government that's just been installed. It has very little capacity. It has no resources. It needed all the help that we could provide. But already this was being moved out of the country. The result, unsurprisingly, was a resurgence in Taliban activity and control of certain areas, particularly in the Pashtun heartland in the south. And this trend was measurable as quickly as 2005. And now we're talking about running away again. There's a lot of political pressure in the United States and other ISAF countries, which has led President Obama and other national leaders to scramble for an exit announcement. Declaring an exit before victory may actually decrease the possibility of achieving one. President Karzai has complained that announcing this date has given the Taliban a much-needed morale boost because they now believe that time is on their side and they can simply wait out the ISAF action. It's only a few more months. And it also demoralizes Afghans, who now begin to fear the repercussions after the ISAF exit. The fear is exploited by the insurgents, who threaten death to anyone who works for the foreigners or the government. So tribal elders in the Pashtun South who have refused to cooperate with the Taliban have been picked off and assassinated, spreading, of course, the fear that security is not guaranteed and that anybody who has not cooperated with these marauding groups is not going to live very long. Civil servants and police, of course, as you would expect, have also been targeted. They're not the only ones, of course. So, we are, of course, eager to negotiate a settlement that will permit an early exit in many ISAF countries. And so negotiating with the Taliban is the favored strategy, with a view to reconciling with all those who accept the Constitution and renounce violence. But it's important to realize that we can't negotiate at any price. In fact, including insurgent groups in some kind of political process has often been necessary in countries with long-standing civil conflicts and insurgencies. But on what terms? And at any cost? That's the question which has to be foremost in our minds and in those of our politicians as we go into this. Because if we're too eager to secure an exit date and any settlement which permits us to leave as expediently as possible, there may be a very high price indeed to be paid for that. There's been a 30% rise in killings of civilians by the Taliban this year. And just this past month, or the preceding month in August, a couple was stoned to death in Kunduz province, which is, by the way, north Afghanistan. It's not traditional Taliban country. But this was a Taliban act. They had run away, they wanted to get married. They were lured back to the village because the local leaders told them everything would be fine, and they were then sentenced and publicly stoned. A pregnant woman was flogged and shot in August. I'm sure you remember the headline. She was accused of committing adultery. Again, there was credit claimed by these local groups. And there's an increasing and very disturbing trend of women in public life being targeted for murder. I'll talk about Lieutenant Colonel Malalai Kakar in a moment, but there have been quite a number of human rights activists who have been systematically eliminated. Sitara Achakzai was, I believe, a provincial council member in Kandahar. She received threatening letters, first of all. This is quite a common tactic. They call them shabnameh, or night letters. And what happens is a school teacher, a female member of parliament, a woman who's working for an NGO, or even the Afghan Human Rights Commission will receive a letter which tells her basically that she needs to stop what she's doing and go home and shut up. Otherwise, she'll be killed. And then very frequently, if they persist, this does indeed happen. So when the next letter is sent to another woman, it often references previous women who are known to have been eliminated. So the trend then spreads, that there's this element of terror which goes on. And in fact, there were 31% of women enrolled in the civil service, working in the civil service in 2006. That's gone down to 21.4 in 2009. This trend has been quite effective in causing people to try and protect themselves by stepping out of the limelight and stopping doing the jobs which are causing this kind of action. Malalai Kakar here was the chief of police in Kandahar. She'd been in the police since 1982, with a forced absence, of course, during the Taliban period. But she was the highest-ranking policewoman in Afghanistan and had been quite vocal in encouraging other Afghan women to enroll in the police force. She was shot by an unidentified gunman en route to work September 28th in 2008. The Taliban claimed responsibility. Now, Malalai is an example of a possible future for Afghanistan. But it's a future that has historical precedents. You've seen some of those pictures. But it's a future which the Taliban and other reactionary forces in society want to abort. Another part of the ongoing trend of intimidation has been the closure of schools. Now, in 2002 and 2003, as part of the Back to School campaign, 3,500 schools opened. In 2003 and 2004, as you know, many of those resources had been moved out to Iraq. In 2005, schools begin to close because of a lack of security. So this is a trend where headmasters, teachers, and so on receive these threatening night letters. Schools are defaced, there's arson, there's bombs. And a favorite tactic, of course, has been the gas of girls' schools, which happened quite recently in Kabul on August 25th, 2010. So in southern provinces, nearly 81% of schools have closed because of this lack of security. And the number of attacks on schools has significantly increased. From 2005 to 2006, there were 2,004 attacks. The number has risen in 2009 to 651. And when there are these attacks which go on in the region, parents become afraid, and girls are often the first to drop out because people are afraid they can't protect their daughters. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic. The cover of Time magazine quite recently. The young woman with a given name by which she's being referred to in the media is Aisha, and she comes from Oruzgan province, which is in the south. She was sentenced by Taliban in Oruzgan province for trying to run away from her husband and in-laws. Her husband, as a matter of fact, was a member of one of these Taliban groups. She was treated quite abominably, the details you may be familiar with, beaten constantly, forced to sleep in a stable, all manner of indignities. And when they became too much, she fled, but was apprehended by the police through some tip-offs from locals and landed in a prison in Kandahar, from which she was subsequently collected and returned to her husband's family, who promised, of course, to treat her better. But a couple of days later, the sentence was pronounced in that village, and it was carried out by her husband and his brother, who took her to a mountainside. Her husband's brother held her down, and her husband cut off her ears and her nose, and they left her there to die. She was eventually taken to a provincial reconstruction clinic. She recovered consciousness, she began to wander, and some sympathetic people who saw her took her to a local clinic. It was run by an American provincial reconstruction team. And they provided for 2 months the intensive care she required. And when she had sufficiently recovered, they moved her to a secret women's shelter in Kabul, where she would be safe from future threats to her life from her husband's family. She has subsequently going to receive treatment in the United States. A team of American surgeons have volunteered to do the 8 months reconstruction surgery she's going to require. And she's been sponsored by an organization called Women for Afghan Women, which has chapters in the United States and Canada. Now, Aisha is a reminder of what may happen if we make a hasty settlement in Afghanistan. Such punishments could again become routine in parts of the country if the Taliban are given a de facto or official control of certain provinces or regions as part of a settlement. So we have to be very careful about what price we're willing to pay for peace. Not that we shouldn't negotiate, but that the terms should not neglect people like Aisha, who will be directly affected by the sort of peace that's made. Nearly 7 in 10 Afghans, in fact, said they support the presence of U.S. forces in their country at the moment, and 61% favor the military buildup of 37,000 U.S. and NATO reinforcements. This was according to a poll conducted by the BBC and ABC News in December 2009. Of course, the rates are lower in the south where the fighting is the most intense, but throughout the country, support at the moment is quite strong. Of course, we can't afford to stay there indefinitely. So the question is, what would success look like? We hear that Afghanistan is an unwinnable war, but perhaps we mean by that we can't eradicate the Taliban militarily. But here are a number of possibilities, some of which are acceptable and some of which I would argue shouldn't be. So centralized democracy is currently the political model that has been the objective in Afghanistan since Karzai undertook leadership with international support. This has been what we have been pushing for. It's a highly centralized model in which all appointments, all control runs through Kabul, and a lot of control particularly rests in the hands of the president. The problem with this, of course, is capacity. And this is an ongoing problem in a lot of countries like Afghanistan, which have had a lot of infrastructure decimated, that there's not a lot of government capacity to actually go out and extend basic services into areas not so close to Kabul. Things like police forces, courts of justice, health services, military if necessary. So the problem with that, of course, is that if the government isn't seen and it's not seen to be effective in those areas, it's very hard to assert control and to prevent other people from stepping into that vacuum, which is exactly what's going on. So there's also the ethnic tension, which has been ongoing in Afghanistan. We've discussed a little bit the very different ethnic groups and the ongoing history of struggle between them. So a centralized government is more legitimate for some than others. And there's a distrust of this centralized government that's out of the way and that you can't really see or hold accountable. But there's a second option, which we might call decentralized democracy. Now, under this, more power is delegated to provinces. Things like the ability to draft or enact budgets, for example, or to elect and approve certain important officials, and perhaps even to use traditional alternatives to centralized justice for some offenses, not all. They might also include the ability to collect local revenue and enforce local regulations. Examples of this model in practice include Bosnia and Ethiopia. Now, the good thing about this is that it promotes local legitimacy and identity. In other words, if you're living in Oruzgan province, you know where your provincial authority is. You can travel there. You can find out what's going on. You know who these people are. So there's more direct communication, which is established. And also, because that provincial group is attached to the central government, it may in fact increase the buy-in in the notion of a national government because it has a local face. A third option is mixed sovereignty. Now, this is an even more dispersed model. There's even more power delegated to the provinces and less to the center. In this model, local leaders rule with near autonomy. Very, very little limitation on what they can do. There might be something as simple as these three. No use of local territory to violate foreign policy, so don't go invading a neighboring country from Bamiyan province or Badakhshan. No violation of the rights or resources of other provinces. And no large-scale theft or exploitation of state-owned national resources. There would, of course, be plenty of space for petty extortion at the provincial level, but Kabul would have to draw the line in terms of state-owned resources like water and mines and things like that. Now, the benefit of this is it sort of legitimates a de facto reality, something which has had long provenance in Afghanistan, where regional commanders exert a great amount of force and very much run the area that they control as they see fit. It does not depend as much on state capacity, which is a big problem in a country which has few resources. So these are the benefits. But of course, the downside is there's a very large margin where abuse can take place. However, it doesn't have to, and there are working examples of this. Nigeria is one of them, but arguably Canada and the United States, which have very, very strong provincial authority, and then a link to a centralized federal government, are examples of a sort of mixed sovereignty model. Switzerland. Whether or not it would play out that way in Afghanistan is another question, but another possibility, of course, is partition. Now, there has been traditional control in the south by the Pashtun, and arguably other ethnic minorities in Afghanistan are not willing to see Pashtun, particularly Taliban, rule of the rest of the country. after recent history. So there may, in fact, be a possibility of dividing the country with a largely Pashtun south and then the rest of the country being separated. Unfortunately, this may happen as a de facto thing through any peace deal that gives the Taliban or those who operate with them control of large parts of the South. It may not be that way on paper, but it may work out that way in practice, which would carry a very high risk. Because regional conflict, again, a return to control of Kabul and other resources may break out between different ethnic groups then, because the country would be divided in that way. And there are global security stakes as well. If you have a Pashtun South which is left to radicalization, once again, it can become an operating base for organizations with a longer arm. So partition, I would argue, is not an attractive possibility. And finally, of course, we can go directly to civil war. If ISAF leaves very quickly without securing a stable situation on the ground, and the Karzai government collapses, you can have an ethnic and regional power struggle take place fairly directly. So in closing, I'd like you to consider a couple of quotations. Take a look at this and see if you can guess where it comes from. I'll read it in case the text is small. The public of the West should rise to the occasion to harness their arrogant governments and get acquainted with the history of Afghanistan, to learn a lesson, pull out of Afghanistan immediately. If they do not do that, their fate will be similar to the fate of the former Soviet Union. These are not the words of your local Stop the War chapter. This is the rest of the quote. Similarly, if the Afghans, siding with the puppet Kabul administration, do not cut off their relation with the moribund regime, they will meet the fate of the former communists. Neither will they find a haven inside the country nor abroad. They will bear the brunt of a heavy loss in this world and the world to come. These are the words of Zabihullah Mujahid, a Taliban spokesman, in a recent posting on the Taliban website. They are very eager for ISAF forces to get out as quickly as possible. And I would argue that in our eagerness to see our brave young men and women come home, that we take a more measured approach to exactly on what terms and how, lest, of course, we be chiming in with this chorus. And then my final quote for today comes from Dr. Sakina Yaqubi. And unfortunately, the quote has been obscured. I'm sorry. She says, the women of Afghanistan completely depend on the NATO allies. As soon as Allied soldiers walk out and leave Afghanistan, the first blood shed will be women and children. Now, Yaqubi is not arguing for an indefinite ISAF presence in Afghanistan. In fact, in the rest of her interview, she was talking about a foreign presence for the next 5 years to stabilize things. She actually runs an organization which works with women to improve health and education in 7 Afghan provinces, and she ran underground schools for girls during the 1990s when the Taliban ruled. She has a lot of experience with taking risks, and she knows what the stakes are. There is a real opportunity to support change from within Afghan society now. Brave men and women have taken great personal risks to challenge injustice, corruption, and impunity. If we leave in haste, these people will be silenced, and many will be killed. I hope that today you have seen that Afghanistan is not a hopeless place. There are many possible futures for that country, and much depends on what we do now. We cannot afford to stay in Afghanistan indefinitely, but neither can we afford to cut and run in 2011. We'll now have time for questions, I think.